So in terms of the rationale for this piece of work, so basically what we wanted to do was to analyse how humanitarian agencies are currently communicating on climate change. So we know that there's a bit of a upswell of public-facing communications from the humanitarian sector in respect to climate change. We all know that it's a really significant issue and it continues to gain traction. And so we wanted to unpack what that actually meant in terms of public-facing communication from the humanitarian side of things. We also wanted, through this research initiative, to provide some practical guidance to humanitarian agencies to be able to apply principles of behavioural science to their climate communications to enhance public engagement. And we also wanted to overcome perceived barriers to climate communications in the sector. And we'll chat a little bit more about those barriers in a second. In terms of methodology and process, we did a fairly comprehensive desk review, 12 in-depth stakeholder interviews that included representatives not only from the humanitarian sector, but also from environmental agencies. And the rationale for that was that we know that the environmental sector has a lot of experience in terms of their public-facing communications on climate change and environmental issues, so that we knew that there was a lot that we could actually learn from that space in terms of being able to frame effective messaging strategies for humanitarian agencies. And then importantly for this piece of work, as I already mentioned, we worked in partnership with an organisation called the Behavioural Architects, which are behavioural science experts. And through this partnership, we applied insights from behavioural science to communications to be able to, I guess, overlay on top of what we were finding through our desk review and from what our interview data said, to be able to apply those principles to ensure what we were putting forward really came from a strong evidence base in terms of how behavioural science can help to shift behaviours of the public through public-facing climate communication. So, context and rationale. So as you can see in the pink box there, this provides a couple of statistics that as humanitarian agencies, we're all fairly on the same page in terms of not necessarily needing to justify that climate change is in fact a humanitarian issue. So, by virtue of us all being at this conference, we know that humanitarian issues are significant for the humanitarian sector. And that we need to be able to collectively do more in terms of our role in advocating for the public to be able to do more in terms of what they're doing on humanitarian issues, but for ourselves to do as humanitarian actors as well. The really critical piece to this piece of work from our side, and I guess noting that as an organisation that's based in Australia, we spoke to a lot of organisations that were also Australia-based. And for us, it was really interesting in terms of the timing, because we were really seeing that public opinion had shifted significantly over the course of the time period that we were doing this piece of research. And there were a couple of reasons behind that. There was, I think we see a lot in the media now. There's a lot more a growing awareness and a groundswell around different subsets of society across the globe really getting on board and climate change becoming less of a polarizing issue and more something that people are less able to actually refute. And so we were seeing that global movement gathering speed, and we know things that like the student climate marches, for example, continue to grow in terms of their numbers and their impact. And the significant thing was that COVID-19 actually made the impact of actions that people were taking on climate change, made it really tangible. So I think that you would all remember, especially at the outset of the pandemic, as much as it was, creating a significant amount of loss of life around the world, that there were some really positive news stories coming out in terms of the impact on the environment when things like flights and transportation and those sorts of things came to a grinding halt. So it was able to then reflect back that, whilst the scale of climate change is obviously so significant, as we can see in some of those alarming statistics in that pink box, that there is still scope for positive moves in the right direction if there are the right disruptors. And the other thing that is specific to the context of Australia is that we went through the worst bushfire season that we had on record, and I'm sure that a lot of you would have seen the impacts of those bushfires broadcast across the world. And for the Australian public, that actually came from a perspective of being quite polarised on the issue of climate change. That shifted people in the direction of wanting having a stronger belief in climate change and the importance of governments and agencies addressing climate change as an issue, but also in terms of reducing how polarising climate change was in the Australian sector, and there was also a big shift in the political context in terms of climate, politicians and the government being a little bit the language around climate change that was previously quite denialist to being much more slightly more supportive of action on climate change. And as I had previously mentioned, the behavioural science overlay in this piece of work was really critical to increase the public engagement in terms of how we understand what motivates us as individuals to take action, and just, I guess, confirming the point that to mitigate climate change, beliefs and behaviours across the board must shift. So I'll just stop sharing this for a little bit. And so there are two questions that I would really love for us to have a little bit of a conversation around. And I'm actually just going to copy these into the chat box. Here we are. So I'll give you a minute to reflect on those two questions, and then it would be great if we can start. I think that it would be actually great to, considering the size of the group, to actually hear from people. So those two questions are: what are some of the biggest challenges for humanitarian organisations in communicating on climate change? So if we can start with that as the first question, I'll open it up to the floor. Would love to hear from people on what you think some of the biggest challenges are in this space.
I know that some humanitarian organizations are already involved. For example, I work with ICVA, so I know that some are already ahead of us in understanding the issue and taking positions on the issue. So, but I think now is the it's the biggest space and right time to engage for all humanitarian organizations to start and continue their engagement and align themselves with the social and climate justice movements. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such a critical point, Mylene. There's a couple of things there that I think are really important in terms of reflections on what you said. The point on timing is such a critical one. There is now, as there hasn't been in the last few years, there's been a little bit more reticence, but I think there are some big events that have shifted things significantly, including the election in the US, which changed the political narrative very strongly in that very influential part of the world. And I think that a combination of things is seeing that there is a real groundswell and a lot more focus and impetus around collective action around climate change. And also your point, Mylene, around the fact that different agencies are at different phases in this. Some agencies are a lot more advanced and have done a lot more public-facing communications, whereas other organisations are still trying to figure out what their value add might be and what their positioning is. And that's, I guess, one of the reasons that we wanted to put out this piece, which I can talk you through those principles after we've had a little bit more of a chat. Does anyone else have any points in terms of what some of the biggest challenges are? I'm also just going to put on my video so you can see me, so it's less like it's just a name or faceless person. Anyone else? What about Florence? Can I be cruel and pick on you, Florence?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. You're doing great in picking on people because I think we're all a bit too shy.
Yes, I'm throwing people under the bus.
Apologies, I have some background noise. I hope you can still hear me. When I was thinking about the question, it's really what matters to me is we're living in a world with such density of communication and topics and tools, and it's overflowing. So I think a challenge for me would be what to communicate to what target group in order to be even seen or heard, or making sure that this is right now their priority in terms of communication needs. So I think there's too much noise going on, and how to stick out and with what message. And am I, as this or that humanitarian organization, the right person to communicate on something I might not be an expert in?
Yeah, and I think that is, what we found is that's been one of the primary barriers. You've identified it there, really hit the nail on the head in terms of what actually is preventing a lot of humanitarian agencies from having more public-facing communications in this issue, is the fact that, yes, you're right, it is a fairly crowded space. There's a lot of messaging around climate issues, and humanitarian agencies, as much as they might have programs that address that mitigate or address the impacts of climate change, they don't feel like they can go hard in terms of having public outreach and public messaging in that sense. And the other thing there that sort of links that point that Desiree, that we found was this issue around issue fatigue, and the fact that there's this perception that because there is information overload, not only around climate and the environment, but in terms of a whole lot of issues that are relevant to humanitarian sector. So agencies feeling like, okay, well, if we need to be strategic about the way that we communicate across the board with our supporters, we're going to pick certain issues and maybe not communicate publicly around things that may not be our core value add or core to our central area of business. So that was one of the barriers as well. There's also another barrier around, and I'd be interested to hear if anybody else, if this resonates for anybody else in terms of the context that you're coming from, is around the fact that in some contexts, public communications that are coming from governments, governments have made climate change a fairly politicized issue in a lot of contexts, and that constrains agencies from feeling like they can have really hard-hitting messaging that goes out publicly, because they don't want to risk a relationship with what in a lot of cases is their back donor. So examples of this would be, as I was talking about in the Australian context, the Australian government previously having quite a conservative stance on climate change, and similarly in the US as well, where I know that there were specific requirements for organisations that received funding from the US in terms of how they were actually able to communicate or not on issues related to climate. So would be really interested to hear if this is an experience that anybody else has come across or has lived at all.
Maybe I'll not really share directly on your question, but I'd like to link that with what a colleague had shared. I think she's called Desiree Walter. Yeah.
Desiree. Mm-hmm.
I think we're in times when communication, there's an overflood of it. And then there's related to what you have just presented. I think there's the issue of once it gets to government, things become sometimes institutionalized. And then how can we repackage that to meet certain needs that are coming up or that are emerging? That, I think, is where I find a lot of challenge in light of the already too much that is already there. And linking to that, one point that comes to mind is for us, then how do we re-strategize ourselves? What sort of alliances can we come up in communication within different institutions, 1, 2, 3, 4, along certain thematics? Because even within climate itself, there are very many themes. Okay, how can we come up with some alliances so that we really leverage on resources? Because sometimes going it alone now, it's very challenging. Yeah, I think that is another direction that I think would be is an aspect of communication that maybe we can hear more from yourself and maybe from the rest of us. Yeah, I think in Germany, one of the things. Yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, in Germany, one of the things is you find like when there are pilot cases coming up, we have 2, 3 agencies that are coming up: World Hunger Health, Caritas, Malteser on localization issues. Then like that, Humedica and others on medical issues. That sort of regrouping alliances, yes, one. But also, how do we package the communication? Because that's where we fail, many of us, yeah.
Yes, great. And this is where I think that the findings from this research initiative and what I can talk you through now in the last 10 minutes that we have will hopefully be useful. So I'll just go through these, and then just before we close, seek another couple of reflections from the group or questions if that's appropriate as well. So exactly to your point, Patrick, the first thing that we found is that complementarity is key. So this is around learning what we can from the environmental movement and working together with both environmental agencies, but also with other humanitarian actors to ensure that our messaging strategies are consistent. Because yes, it's confusing for humanitarian agencies when there is such a as Desiree pointed out, so much information. There's information overload to be able to figure out what kind of messaging you should be putting out. So working together is a really good way to come up with shared messaging that doesn't duplicate and that has greater impact. The second consideration is around positive framing. So I think that we all will have seen alarmist communications and climate change, and in some contexts and to some extent those work. But from a behavioural science perspective, in terms of creating positive changes in behaviour, positive emotional appeals are more effective than the alarmist strategies. So this, I guess, framing things in terms of how things can progress if human behaviour changes in the right way, so people can associate that with a positive future rather than the doom and gloom messaging that I think that we're also all quite familiar with. The third point, focus on human stories, and as humanitarian agencies, we're in a really good position to be able to draw on some of the stories from the people that we work with in crisis-affected communities. So this is a really strong strategy for humanitarians to be able to show the impact on populations and individuals and have those human stories really come to the fore and to the front of their communication strategies. Help your audience to connect global to local. This is a really, really important point, and certainly something that we found in Australia through the bushfire season, that as much as people might not be able to understand and to connect with the impacts of climate change as they're being felt in a remote area of Somaliland, for example, if you're based in somewhere like Australia or wherever you are, that feels too far away and a little bit too much to grapple for the general public in a certain context. But evidence shows that all audiences actually care about the local impacts of climate change and how it's affecting them and their families and their friends in their day-to-day lives. So if you're able to contextualize your global stories and your global stories that have a human focus to ensure that they speak to people's everyday realities. So as I said, with the bushfires, public opinion shifted so significantly because people were able to see here in Australia the impact of climate change when it was, brought home as an issue for them. So being able to then, connect that with some of those global issues is a really important strategy to help people have salience with the message. Communicate in line with humanitarian principles. So as I was chatting about, the politicisation of climate change can be a barrier for humanitarians, feeling like they can't speak out too loudly in a certain way because it may be in contravention, it may be perceived as not being neutral. So remaining neutral, maintaining their neutrality and being apolitical in climate communications minimises the risk of polarising or isolating audiences. So it's not about going out there necessarily and being really bold and pushing a hardcore advocacy agenda against a political narrative, but around using humanitarian principles and humanitarian imperative in the as core to the communication strategy. Evidence is really critical, not evidence in terms of overdoing it, but in terms of weaving it into the narrative. So emotional appeals will get people's attention, but facts are needed to back up your claims and to ensure that it's not sort of an overly emotive approach that people don't feel like there's any sort of scientific backing or evidence to. Anchoring your messages to clear visions, simple messages and concrete actions. So if you lead with a positive vision, as we were talking about that positive framing, this is really empowering rather than overwhelming. Being clear and simple with messaging and repeating consistent messages as well. These are the most effective. These are most effective in terms of strategies. So having a few positive statements and visions and messages that are repeated over and over again, rather than trying to have sort of different things that you're saying. Really focus on clear, critical communication strategies. And finally, figuring out what not to say. So avoid counterproductive messaging because this is also critical to avoid overwhelming your audience or unintentionally reinforcing false debate. So that is a brief summary. As I said, these principles are based on what we learned throughout that research methodology and have a very strong behavioural science lens to them. So in the last couple of minutes, I would just like to open up for any further final reflections from those of you who are still on the call. And sorry, Mylene, I just noticed your point there, your question there. So an example of positive framing, Mylene, I guess, would be focusing on on stories where there has been a positive impact of behaviour change in terms of the impact on the environment. So rather than, I guess, on the flip side, Mylene, is the image that we're all fairly aware of, the polar bear standing, the emaciated polar bear standing on an ice cap. Which shows that this is the vision and the reality of the world if we don't do anything. But rather focusing, the positive framing will be focusing on the positive side of things. So this is what the world looks like if we're able to rally together and to be able to better support collective action on climate. Before we do get pulled in, thank you so much to you all. Apologies for the jumping in and out of the session at the start. I do encourage you to access the publication Creating Climate, Creating Communication That Works, which is available on the Humanitarian Advisory Group website. And please do feel free to reach out if you do have any further questions at all about this piece of work or how it might be applied in your specific context as well.